Surprisingly, this chickpea demonstration is being led by us here at the Yorkton Research Farm, where no chickpea has been grown before. Other participating sites include Melfort, Indian Head, and Swift Current. Chickpeas are not typically grown in the black soil zones of Saskatchewan. Chickpeas are an indeterminate plant and will continue to flower into fall in wet climates. This means flowering may not stop until a killing frost, which results in green seed. Best management practices in terms of seeding date, seeding rate, and variety selection may vary between regions within Saskatchewan. Assessing these differences is particularly important for the northeast regions of Saskatchewan, where chickpeas are not typically grown. This study is evaluating 3 varieties of Kabuli chickpeas, seeded on May 12th at our location and May 26th. At targeted plant stands of 18, 37, and 56 plants per meter squared. We came very close to achieving those plant populations. CDC Lancer, CDC Pasqua, and CDC Orkney are all Kabuli varieties we are comparing, and they're all tolerant to the herbicide Solo ADV, which is what was sprayed here. In terms of seeding rate, Kabuli chickpeas in Canada current recommendations are 33 to 44 seedlings per meter squared. Past studies usually find that delayed seeding can significantly impact chickpea yields, with reductions of 12 to 15% observed in southwestern Saskatchewan when seeding was delayed by 15 to 21 days. Research conducted in Swift Current and Scott, Saskatchewan, demonstrated that delayed seeding by 2 weeks resulted in 34% yield loss, while a 4-week delay led to a more substantial 44% yield loss. However, these findings were not consistent across all years and locations. Notably, in 1 year at Scott, chickpea yields doubled when seeding was delayed by 4 weeks. This unexpected result was attributed to unique rainfall patterns that favored the late-seeded crop. On the flip side, chickpeas are considered a warm season crop and may be sensitive to early planting due to low temperature stress, which can affect seedling emergence, vigor, and susceptibility to soil-borne diseases. So the optimum time to seed chickpeas may be very small. Well, let's see how our site made out. This is our first time with chickpeas, and I've got my fingers crossed. Well, what I'm going to show you from Yorkton looks really impressive in terms of yield and seed size. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. Our crop looked really good for most of the summer, not a spot of disease from Ascochyta. We were relatively dry for most of the summer, which is actually ideal for chickpeas. But then, a moist fall affected our seed quality by harvest. If you look closely at these samples from the trial, you will see green and moldy seed, along with some sprouting. Surprisingly, aflatoxin levels were still acceptable, but it's hard to see this being accepted for human consumption. So keep this in mind as I share the data from Yorkton. Here we're looking at the relative maturities between varieties at Yorkton and Melfort. These are in Julian days at which physiological maturity was achieved. Maturity rankings between varieties were very similar at Yorkton and Melfort, with CDC Pasqua being the longest maturing and CDC Lancer being the shortest maturing variety. There was about a 5 to 6 day difference between the earliest and latest maturing varieties. This ranking in maturities between varieties is supported by regional information in the Provincial Varieties of Grain Crops publication. Increasing seeding rate significantly hastened maturity at Yorkton and Melfort by 3 to 4 days. You'll recall from the introduction that our low seeding rate targeted 18 plants per meter squared. The standard was 37 plants per meter squared, and the high seeding rate targeted 56 plants per meter squared. Increasing seeding rate also hastened maturity at Indian Head, but the effect was more pronounced for Orkney relative to the other varieties. The reason for this is unclear, as increasing seed rate provided similar increases in plant stands between the varieties. Seeding early resulted in significantly higher yields at Indian Head and Melfort. However, there was a significant seeding date by seeding rate interaction at Indian Head that we'll have to take a look at later. Varietal standings in terms of yield were very similar between Indian Head and Melfort, with CDC Lancer yielding significantly more than CDC Orkney and in turn yielded significantly more than CDC Pasqua. The varietal rankings were largely in keeping with regional data. Swift Current followed a similar pattern, but there was a significant three-way interaction which caused some discrepancies. In contrast to the other locations, CDC Lancer was significantly lower yielding than both varieties at Yorkton. At Melfort, yield significantly increased with increasing seeding rate to the high rate. While yield increased with increasing seeding rate at Yorkton, the effect was insignificant. Yield at Indian Head and Swift Current were also responsive to increasing seeding rate, but there were interactions. At Swift Current, the optimum seeding rate for yield varied between seeding date and variety, but I won't bore you with the details because they were small differences and the reasons were unclear. At Indian Head, yield was essentially maximized at the standard rate when seeded early, whereas yield continued to climb significantly to the high rate when seeded late. The significance of this interaction is not clear. Perhaps hastening of maturity with increasing seeding rate was more beneficial to yield when seeding late. Alright, let's focus on treatment effects on seed size. Large-sized chickpeas are desired, and the market will offer a premium for them. Quality is determined by running chickpeas through a series of sieves with hull radii ranging from 24R, which is 24/64ths of an inch, to 14R in increments of 2R. Premiums will be determined based on a percent of seed retained by each sieve. These response curves are showing the percent seed that was retained on each sieve. To receive a premium, the end user is looking for a pattern which is heavily weighted to the left and comes crashing down by the 18R sieve. In other words, they want lots of big seed and very few small seeds. This premium standard was not achieved by any combination of seeding date, variety, and seeding rate in this study. Here we're looking at the effect of seeding date on chickpea seed sizing for each location. Early seeded is in blue and late seeded is in orange. At Yorkton and Melfort, the seed sizing followed a very similar pattern between seeding dates, albeit seed size was greater at Yorkton. Early seeding led to greater seed size at Indian Head and Swift Current, as indicated by a relative shift of the blue line to the left. Early seeding can increase yield and seed size, as it gives the plants more time for flowering and pod filling. Seed sizing between varieties followed a consistent pattern at each location. A larger seed size for CDC Pasqua and orange is indicated by its relative shift to the left compared to the other varieties. In turn, CDC Orkney in green is shifted to the left relative to CDC Lancer in blue, indicating larger seed for CDC Orkney relative to Lancer. These results are in keeping with those published in the Saskatchewan Varieties of Grain Crops Guide. Overall, seeding rate had little effect on seed size, as you can hardly distinguish between the response curves in these figures. There were some interactions, but the effects were usually small, inconsistent, inconsequential, and difficult to explain, so I won't try. Conclusions. Seeding chickpeas early at the standard seeding rate was most likely to provide the best results in terms of yield and seed size. While the high seeding rate could hasten maturity further without typically affecting seed size, the highest seeding rate occasionally produced the lowest yield, which is clearly uneconomical. The standard seeding rate seemed to be the best hedge because it could result in the highest yield, whereas the highest yield was never associated with the low seeding rate. CDC Pasqua was often the lowest yielding, later maturing variety, but it had the greatest seed size. Also keep in mind that seed quality had deteriorated by harvest in response to some wet weather at Yorkton. So I'm not advocating that chickpeas should be grown near Yorkton. Special thanks to the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers and SCAP for funding this project.